Welcome back to Mornings with Zerlinas. Joining us on the phone, Rebekah Caruthers, Vice President of the Fair Election Center. And good morning to you. Happy Friday.
Good morning. Happy Friday. Happy second day of Black History Month.
I feel like Black History Month needs to be longer. How come they only gave us the shortest month of the year? I feel like they shouldn't have done that. It's not enough days.
Feel like we need to go back and tell Carter G. Woodson, like, hey, don't pick Black History Week in February. Pick a different month. But
That's
fortunately,
real.
it's a leap year. It's a leap year.
Right.
We get extra day.
One extra day. I feel like we're gonna have to do so much in that extra day on the 29th. Um, but but let's talk about the 2024 election coming up. I feel like voter suppression, voter ID, voting rights, it's not something that we're talking about as much as we normally do during an election year. Maybe because like the whole democracy is on the line, but take us through the lay of the land in terms of voting access in this year's election.
There is so much. A lot of voters, they vote in federal election years. So the last time many of our voters have voted was 2022. And before that, the high water mark was in 2020. And since then, over 40 states have introduced voter suppression bills. And I know when you say voter suppression, people are like, well, what does that mean? Is this, whites only, colors only? What do these terms mean? And it goes back to everything from Georgia saying, hey, if elders of our community are standing in line for 8, 10, 12 hours, which is crazy anyway, we could no longer give them water and food.
Mm-hmm.
And if we give them water and food, that could be a felony in Georgia. Or you take a state like Florida that says, hey, if you live in an apartment building or a condo complex and you have 3 elderly neighbors that you want to help them with their ballot and turn it in, Florida is now saying you can become a convicted felon because you're helping more than 2 people with their ballot. So there's been a lot of craziness like that. Or we can look at the state of Ohio, which is further restricting voter ID. North Carolina is the same. And so, even though over 40 states have introduced legislation, dozens of states have actually passed legislation that makes it harder and tougher to vote this year.
It's so frustrating to hear that, right? Because I think the Georgia, especially the water thing, got so much attention during the 2020 elections, and obviously we were in the middle of a global pandemic. So I definitely don't want anybody's grandma outside of the house standing on the line for 8 hours, not being able to get food and water just to exercise their right to vote. But I feel like not enough conversation is had about why people propose these kind of laws in the first place. Like, is the goal and intention to suppress the vote? I mean, that can be the only reason, right?
Well, we no longer have to guess. There's been different lawsuits in several states, and we found on record state legislators saying, hey, we don't want Black people to vote. And it's not just Black people, it's young people. We're hearing folks who have more of a conservative bent, I'll just say it that way, saying too many college students are voting. They're rolling out of their beds in their dorm rooms. They're showing up to the polling locations in their pajamas, and then they're going back to their dorms to go back to sleep. Guess what? That's a good thing. We
Right.
should want young people and our newest voters engaged in our democracy because active people engaged in our democracy are those who are going to want to ensure its future and its success.
I love the idea that like a young person in their pajamas, like, how dare they get out of bed and go participate in democracy and go back to sleep? Like, that is a sign of like, I don't know, like laziness. Like, they shouldn't be like doing that. Like, no, if a young person is getting out of bed to go vote, I mean, like, they go to class in their pajamas. What's the difference? Like, it just shows that people's age. Cause like that's how long it's been since you've been in college, right? Because you're judging going outside in your pajamas. Maybe like maybe you should go outside in your pajamas more and do things you need to be doing. What are some of the other persistent barriers to voting? You mentioned voter ID, and I feel like that got a lot of attention when a lot of states were introducing voter ID laws. And the comeback is always, well, you need to show an ID to get on an airplane. And I was always like, well, that's not a fundamental right. So talk a bit about some of the other persistent barriers like a voter ID that really stand in the way of folks being able to just participate in their democracy, pajamas and all?
Sure. We could talk about different segments of our population. We could talk about those who are returning citizens, meaning that they were convicted of a felony, they served their time, they're trying to get reacclimated back into society. And one of the number one ways to make sure that someone has success outside of prison is for them to be civically engaged. And one way to be civically engaged is to be able to vote. Well, there are certain states that are making it, much tougher. So, like my organization has a lawsuit going in Virginia. We're representing some returning citizens, and the reason why we're suing Virginia is because they have arbitrary rights restoration. And
Hmm.
what that means for your listeners, it means that the governor gets to like ad hoc decide who he is or who he isn't. I'm going to restore their voting rights. And so for us, our case for democracy and being a pro-democracy organization is that there should be consistency in rights restoration. I mean, we have some states that say, hey, even in prison, you still should be able to vote. So the District of Columbia is a jurisdiction that allows that. I think Maine is another jurisdiction that has some pretty strong um, pro-voting laws. But then you have states like Tennessee. Tennessee's legislature just introduced a piece of legislation that says, well, if you want to have your rights restored to vote in Tennessee, you need to first be eligible to have a gun. Now, tell me where in the Constitution it says in order to have one constitutional right recognized, you first have to have another constitutional right recognized. That doesn't even make sense.
Right.
And Tennessee is one of the most over policed states. There right now, 20% of Black adults in Tennessee are ineligible to vote just off the rip because of their onerous legislation, their onerous bills when it comes to voting rights restoration.
That's so frustrating because I feel like, and I'll take the privilege to say, I think it's ironic that there is a front runner for a political party for president that's facing 91 felonies, which in some states would make him ineligible to vote if he were convicted of any single felony. So I'll just take that privilege to say that's ironic. But also talk a bit about how that that specific thing disenfranchises certain communities, right? Because certain communities are over policed, over prosecuted, right? They're because of the structural factors more likely to end up incarcerated, facing the removal of their voting rights because of a felony.
Right. And so let's look at some historical context. In this country, the idea of having what's called like a civic death, or where someone
Mm.
can't vote, they lose a lot of their civil liberties because of their felon status. Even the idea of even restricting someone's ability to vote, it was only one or two states that really did that. But once slavery ended, once all of a sudden you have black codes and you start to see schemes across the South to basically criminalize black folks just for living. Like if too many black folks were gathered together, it became a crime. If black
Mm.
folks didn't have a job, it became the crime of vagrancy. If black, loitering, that's what I was referencing when too many black people get together. It was like all these schemes that started to happen to criminalize just black people for existing post-slavery. And so then all of a sudden you start to see on the books, hey, well, if you are a convicted felon, your right to vote gets stripped away. And it's not, I know the I word used earlier was ironic. I could think of some other choice words, but it's still it's still early in the morning for those choice words. But we can clearly see as Black folks were now made into full citizens into this country and we're starting to exercise the right to vote, then there start to be schemes to take away that right to vote. And so Even now, there's nothing in the Constitution saying that someone's right to vote should be stripped away because they have a felony. People still have the right to free speech, which is a First Amendment right, regardless if they have a felony or not. So why is the right to vote also taken away? Because they still should be able to have choice in how they want society to go, how they want to interact with society. But that's a much bigger conversation. One of the biggest issues with the reason why voting rights should be paramount at top of mind for most Americans right now is that the Voting Rights Act is basically in shambles.
Right.
And, we really needed this administration to make voting rights a priority. And I know some folks say, oh, well, there isn't enough of a pro voting rights majority in the House and Senate to pass it. However, we've seen other things pass. We've
Mm.
seen exceptions to the rules package on the Senate side to change the rules for passage to end closure, where you don't necessarily need 60 votes to end debate for something to go to the floor. And so we really need to see strong leadership saying, hey, let's take a time out here without securing the right to vote for all eligible Americans. We don't have a democracy. And so I'm calling on our leaders to support democracy, whether it's through executive orders, whether it's through meaningful legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
I put the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in my notes because I wanted to ask you about that and remind people what was in it, right? Because I think that, you know, we on this program talk about policies and issues. And I always say to folks, like, obviously, the message every day is, what are you doing to protect American democracy? That's my question for the group every single day. And the reason I say that is because climate, abortion, immigration, whatever issue you care most passionately about, you can't affect change on that issue unless we all have access to the ballot box so that we can make our voices heard. So remind everybody what's in that John Lewis Voting Rights Act so we know what to say when we call our elected officials.
Oh, there's so much good stuff in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The first thing that it does is modernize the Voting Rights Act formula, which determines which states and localities have a pattern of discrimination. And so this goes back to the Supreme Court saying, hey, we know all these bad things have happened a really long, long time ago, back when pictures were still black and white and not in color. We ought to give states a pass and give them the benefit of the doubt instead of just assuming that they're going to do bad stuff. Well, guess what? The provisions that protect the formula, and what the formula is, it determines which counties or municipalities have to submit their changes on voting locations, precinct locations, their changes on whether or not there's going to be voting ID, their changes on the rules with how we vote and who's eligible to vote. They would have to submit that to the Department of Justice for the Department of Justice to review it to make sure that there wasn't going to be discriminatory impact. And that's very important. Since we no longer have that provision, like it's the reason why in Georgia, it's now a felony to give someone food or drink if they're standing in line. It's the reason why Arizona is an example. The last couple of years, their legislature introduced legislation saying, hey, we're going to determine the types of voter ID in order to vote. And you have to put your weight on there. If your weight is not listed on your voter ID, you're not eligible to vote. And so our response was like, what do you mean you have to list your weight in order to determine your eligibility to vote? So I don't know about you all and your listeners. I lie about my weight on any ID that I have. So if I show up in person to vote and, you can tell I kind of, fudged a little bit what my weight is, does that make me ineligible to vote? And so it's been a lot of just like random and weird stuff that just, nonsensical, or even it's been solutions in search of a problem. Like we haven't seen these large scale problems that the anti democracy legislators seem to think is happening in this country. So modernizing the VRA's formula just to make sure that people are doing the right thing as they're making adjustments on voting rules. Ensuring that last minute voting changes do not adversely affect voters by requiring officials to publicly announce all voting changes at least 180 days before an election. This is important because the last federal cycle in the state of Mississippi, they moved dozens and dozens of voting locations. However, when you went to the state's website, it didn't list any of the changes. People didn't know until they were showing up to vote, and they were trying to get information, and then they found out that their polling location had been moved. And even in some of the local like county websites, all of the information wasn't accurate. So if we're going to have a free and fair election, folks should actually know what's going on. They should know what their voting location is, especially if they voted at the same Methodist church around the corner for the last 20 years, then all of a sudden gets moved and they're not told that it was moved. Like, that doesn't make sense. And if we're looking to have an inclusive democracy and active participation, then those things simply shouldn't happen.
My next question is, do you think the people that create these laws want to have an inclusive and representative democracy?
No, absolutely not. Like, I've seen some really wild and crazy statements over the last few weeks with people just saying, well, I don't want them to vote. It's too many people to vote. I mean, even watching the Republican primary and hearing a former governor, Nikki Haley, talk about how, this country, there was no racism and that we should go back to the glory days. I think about those glory days, alleged glory days, and the impact it would have had on my family. And I think about a lot of the Black folks that I know who had to pay poll taxes.
Mm-hmm.
I think about those who were intimidated into not voting. And, so we didn't have, those good old days the way some folks seem to think. And so there's some people in this country, and it happens to be a lot of the anti-democracy folks who want us to go back to the days of where rich white men with lots of property and resources are the ones who make the decisions in this country. And that simply shouldn't be if we are a democracy.
It's like, good for who? Who was it good for? And what year are you talking about? Like, what 6-month period are you referring to where it was good for everybody? Because I don't see that in my history book. Also, it's just like, I mean, we laugh, but again, like the history that you're talking about when you're talking about your family members, I'm thinking about my grandfather and aunt who marched in Selma. This is not a long time ago. I always remind our listeners, like, I can call my aunt on the phone. You know why? Because she's alive. Right. So we're not talking about like 250 years ago. We're talking about like just a second ago. Right. John Lewis passed away recently. Right. We're talking about him being beaten just because he was marching for the right to vote, not to be the president. Not he wasn't marching because he was like, I'm going to be the king of America. No, we all of those people in Selma on the Edmund Pettus, they were being beaten because they wanted to participate in American democracy. And so that was in recent history. It wasn't 700 years ago.
No, and these were college students. Yesterday was February 1, which is the anniversary of the four from North Carolina A&T, who, for them, it wasn't just like even with voting rights, but it was the right to integrate the Woolworths counter, in Greensboro, North Carolina. But shout out to the Bennett Bells who actually spent a lot of time planning that. And yes, we know the four at A&T kind of jumped a little bit too fast, and the Bennett Bells, helped them in that situation. Want to recognize, the women who were involved with that as well. But the point is, these were college students who looked at the world around them and said, you know what, this is not acceptable. We want to use our voices and we want to do something about it. And that's the same thing that we're going to see in 2024. We're going to see a lot of young people stepping up and saying, the world as we know it is not acceptable. We want to change it. And one of the ways we're going to change it is through the ballot box.
So important. I want to talk a bit about poll workers because I think we've talked about obviously the barriers for voters to participate, but there's also a persistent attack, threats, and violence against poll workers, election workers, people that are volunteering their time to go on election day to work the polls to ensure that the process works fairly for their fellow community members. Talk a bit about why people should sign up to become poll and election workers if they haven't thought about that as a way to participate in American democracy, but also the threats that some of those folks are facing. So we can support them hopefully and stand up for them and align our values with them because they're the champions of this democracy we love.
Sure. So at Fair Election Center, we have an initiative called Work Elections, and you can find more information at workelections.org. We help co-found Power the Polls, and that is a project to try to diversify poll workers. There's over 5,200 jurisdictions in this country that is actively looking for poll workers. It historically has been largely older people and largely white. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to make sure that it was diverse in terms of ethnicity and race. We wanted to make sure it was diverse in terms of even age. And we have been, successful with that, with recruiting. Like in 2020, that was definitely a high water mark, where we had over 700,000 folks who came directly to workelections.org. We had well over 1 million folks who went to Power the Polls website.
Mhm.
And the value in having people from a community to actually be the ones to work the polls is tremendous. Like another example, once again, shout out to North Carolina A&T. Their students showed up in November, December to a local commission meeting, and they were able to secure a polling site on their campus. And so now we're going to be working to make sure that it's students who are the poll workers, because
Mm.
we know if students see other students, if they see their classmates, if they see their dorm mates, if they see their sorority sister, their fraternity brother working the polls, we know that's going to encourage more students to show up to vote. Um, and when you talk about safety, even not just with poll workers, but to a greater extent with election workers. We saw the attack that Rudy Giuliani did
Mm.
against the
Mm.
election workers in Georgia. And it was a very real attack. And we see that, he's going to go bankrupt trying to pay them, but I still hope that they're able to get, money from Rudy Giuliani. But it has been troubling. There are people who have worked in election administration for years and years who have since left the profession because the number of attacks that they've gotten, especially from the anti-democracy folks who really seem to be, have a particular political ideology from attacking them and to causing other folks to threaten them. So that is very real.
I hope they get all his money. Listen, I'm like, empty the account. No, empty the
All this
account,
money.
all of it.
I'm, I'm
Transfer it till he has a zero balance. Okay, zero. No, overdraft it. That's a, get it all of it, all the
right.
accounts.
The
Take all the
first
money.
100 million should be because of the Central Park Five and all the stuff he did as mayor,
Exactly,
and then the second
exactly.
100 million should go. Yeah.
I feel that as somebody who grew up in New Jersey. Let me just say the karma coming back to Rudy Giuliani, it's, I don't know, it's satisfying to me as somebody who grew up with Rudy Giuliani in close proximity to me as a young person, seeing all the things that happened, especially the way he reacted to the police killing Black people, unarmed Black people.
Yes.
I want to talk in the last few minutes here about misinformation. You mentioned obviously polling locations changing, but one of the things I remember as an organizer in 2008 is like the flyers that would go out the week before the election telling all the Black people to vote on Wednesday. And I feel like misinformation is something we should address in this moment where it's so prevalent everywhere in terms of voting and voter access.
Absolutely. Before coming to Fair Election Center, I worked on campaigns off and on for about 20 years. And the misinformation, especially targeting Black voters, has always happened.
Mm,
Everything from, like you said, the flyers to the phone calls saying, hey, don't you know that, the election has been moved up? I worked in supporting, Obama in 2008 across the South. It was definitely wild. Um, One thing that is especially nefarious this year is the use of deep fakes
mm,
and
mhm,
AI
right.
to spread misinformation. And so, one of the things that I really encourage folks is to, when you see something, one, check to figure out, check the website that's pushing it out. And you could do that by going to the About section of the website to figure out what is the perspective of this website with the information that they are pushing out. The next thing is, if you find something and you're not sure about the accuracy, or you think it's crazy and you haven't seen it anywhere else, before you share it, even on social media, check two, three, or four other websites or sources that to actually be news websites, to see if they're also reporting the same story before you post it. Because oftentimes you will see something that is the website
Hmm.
cnn.xyz.com. That is not the same as CNN, right?
Right.
And so it's even checking the URL to see, okay, what is the source of this information? But we're going to see, we're going to see an uptick in that. And just like we see some of the targeting towards Black women, towards Black men, towards young Black folks, we're going to see, a lot of rhetoric that isn't, rooted in the truth. So
Mm.
folks really need to do a little bit of research. Don't just go with what your favorite entertainment person is saying. I'm glad that there's people from all walks of life who are interested in our politics. But when it comes down to actually getting information, you have to verify your source and verify where they're getting the information, not just because you love their music, so therefore you're going to listen to what they're saying. You actually have to you actually have to do a little bit more digging this year.
It's so important about deep fakes and the use of AI. I feel like 2016 was, like just baby steps in this direction in terms of the misinformation, right? Obviously there was so much misinformation about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton's record, targeted to certain constituencies. I'm thinking millennials and Gen Zs of color, that were targeted with this information to sort of divide everyone, along with just the standard misinformation that we see about election day being on the wrong day. Election day is never going to be on a Wednesday, y'all. It's on a Tuesday. It's always on a Tuesday. So if you ever see any misinformation like that, know that it is not correct. Rebekah Caruthers from the Fair Election Center, thank you for this very important conversation in this critical election year. We need to stay woke in terms of making sure that these folks don't derail us from participating in our democracy so that we can protect it. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on this Friday morning. Please stay safe and have a great weekend.
Great. And one more thing, I just want to say RIP to Joe
Thank you.
Madison. He's a voice that we will definitely miss this election year. I cannot be on this platform without acknowledging his transition with becoming an ancestor.
Yes, thank you so much for that remembrance of the Black Eagle, the late and great Joe Madison. We were spending the entire first hour of the program this morning remembering his legacy and hopefully every day trying to live up to his legacy. If we're even lucky, right? If we can even get in the same stratosphere. Rebekah, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We're going to take a very quick break, and then we're going to be joined by Reverend Dr. William Barber, and we're going to talk about the moral case for a ceasefire in Gaza after this very quick break. Very quick break. Very quick break.